Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Strife's Sanctum podcast. My name is Citizen Strife, and I decided to make a change to my schedule, kind of short notice, and continue on with my talk about Bloodstained and kind of go back in reverse to talk about the last two Castlevania games that I remember playing. Because Lords of Shadow existed in some other forms and, other co-op games and shit. But Konami didn't do anything with the franchise, at least anything meaningful, after these two. It was Portrait of Ruin and Order of Ecclesia. And these were the other two games added to the DS after Dawn of Sorrow. And it's almost appropriate that I talk about them because Konami, finally getting its head up out of its ass, has decided to release those three games as the Dominus collection. It was like 2-3 weeks ago. And I did not play them myself yet, but I heard enough about what they changed, to at least manage the ports, and specifically the Dawn of Sorrow version. They ended up getting rid of the seals, and now you can use it via button prompts instead of having to use the fucking stylus. Probably the way it should have been all along, but whatever. Weird, quirky things aside. But as far as these two games go, they don't give a shit about the stylus at all. They're just more Castlevania games. And they are good Castlevania games. Are they the best ones? No. They both share issues in different ways, as trying to be different from the Castlevania lore, trying to be different from the Castlevania setup, and mainly by virtue of trying to kind of distance itself from the Belmont-ish stuff, and that was starting long before with Arya and Dawn, but Portrait and Order definitely try to add to the Castlevania lore without trying to be too far gone. They kind of take different paths and different parts of the overarching story and try to just flesh things out. Because at this point, it was established via Lament of Innocence that the story kind of started around the 1200s, the 1100s, give or take. And everything after that point for like 800, 900 years has been this never-ending war and never-ending situation. But by and large, it's mostly been Belmonts doing it. There have been changes here and there. Castlevania Bloodlines, Circle of the Moon, and the Sorrow games. And now these ones, they're not focusing on the Belmonts. And it's interesting how they try to manage that while still making it about Dracula, or in some cases, not about Dracula at all. These two do what the Soma Cruz games didn't do. They bring Dracula back as the main villain, but that's kind of the key to it all, is they try and find ways to tie in unrelated bloodlines or distant relatives or descendants into the mythos so it doesn't really get in the way. And the benefit of having pretty much 800 or 900 years to work with is that you can. The only instance that they couldn't get to, and I don't know if they're ever going to now that the Castlevania thing is pretty much dead at this point, is the game where Dracula dies in 1999. But everything kind of filters around the initial games, the Belmont legacy, the whip that they use, all of the stuff. They developed how it works and how it goes forward, how you create it, how you make it, and everything just kind of filters in, and everybody kind of gets involved in different fashions. And both of these games take different strides to get there. One of them is about a branch family of whatnot being bequeathed the vampire killer, and basically using it to get rid of other vampires. The second game, Order, is about developing different means of containing or destroying Dracula, because the never-ending presence, he's always going to be there, so how do you get rid of him if the whip doesn't even exist? So they take different tacks to get to the same place. Castlevania's never really been one for story. It's been more about setting a mode, and I said this even with Bloodstained. It's immaterial to the larger scheme of things, because nobody's playing a Castlevania game for the story. Nobody's playing a Mega Man game for the story. It's just not the way it's going to be. This is not like Metal Gear or something. This is not a Final Fantasy game. They give you enough of a story that you're there to kill monsters and explore castles, at least most times. But again, these two games do, and which is why they're both together in this, is they try again to do different situations with the characters and not even be in the castle all that much. So we'll start with Portrait of Ruin. We have Jonathan Morris, a relative and son of the character in Castlevania Bloodlines. He's got the whip, but he doesn't know how to use it and doesn't have the power to use it. And a friend, Charlotte Olin, A-U-L-I-N. Owlin? I don't know how you would say that. They're together. She's a mage, and apparently part of the Belnades bloodline, because that's what all mages are, apparently. But not affiliated to an extent. But they're together to try and stop Bronner, this new vampire who is taken up residence in Dracula's castle to turn it into his own. The method of doing this is to take a couple of people known as Stella and Loretta, taking them as his daughters, and using the power of paintings to kind of seal off Dracula's power. Death is kind of lingering around as this ever-present threat, because he's Dracula's right-hand man, and, he's Death. He can do that shit. So Jonathan and Charlotte have to go to different paintings to weaken Bronner's power. The main issue with Portrait of Ruin is that the castle itself is almost immaterial. You're kind of going through enough of it to get to those places with the paintings, and then it's pretty much, instead of having one large castle, you have a mini castle where like 1 to 2 lengths of stages are now mini stages. Victorian London, you've got an Egyptian place, another town which is just some weird carnival-esque madhouse looking place, and then a academy forested area sort of thing. So it's different enough. I don't know if I like that setup, and I like it even less in Order, because what Order does is you bounce around from different areas. Shanoa and Albus are these two members of Ecclesia with their master Barlow, who are trying to create these glyphs in their bodies where they can kind of take the power bequeathed to them, magic power, fighting power, whatnot, kind of like the Souls mechanic, and also kind of like the Shardbinder mechanic in Bloodstained. So you can see the link there, where Shanoa and Albus can do and practically use any skill as long as they've absorbed it. Albus escapes with Dracula's Dominus power, which is supposedly capable of, suppressing his power and killing him if he was ever to come back. And the main issue is that the game kind of takes this cat and mouse approach. Albus is kind of bouncing back and forth, and the stages aren't even in the castle. They're outside of things. It feels kind of like one of the old school Castlevania games where you're not really in a castle for a majority of it, and you're just kind of in the outskirts. You're in forests and other places, and you're doing things. You're in villages. weird caves and chapels and churches. So a lot of the stuff in both games that you would be doing in side paths in the castle as progression, you do in a different way. And when I was looking into these games before, I was thinking, oh, this is a cool idea. This is not the traditional large castle or two large castles that have kind of been the norm. But in practice and in execution, they don't really... It doesn't work for some reason. I think it's because they're way too short on their own, and it feels like because they're not connected to the castle, they don't feel as substantial. Like when you're playing Symphony of the Night, you know that these places are, 15, 20 minutes, 30 minutes all together, but they all feel interconnected, and you're wandering, you're doing things, and you're going around and fighting things. When you're disconnecting them from everything else, it feels like the backtracking has to take a different approach, because you got to go out of the castle, then you got to do the thing, you got to find the thing, and there's still the backtracking there for different reasons, but it just feels like the castles themselves don't have as much flavor because they're trying to take away some of the areas from that. It also doesn't help that both games suffer from reusing areas. Like, you fight Bronner shit in the first 4 stages, and then you get to the end of the castle, and then you open that shit up by going through the 4 stages all over again. So you're repeating things you've already done. Why are you doing that? And then in Ecclesia, you get to Castlevania, or Dracula's Castle, with like an hour to spare. Because you're wandering around doing everything, and then you get like the second half of the game is in Castlevania. Now it just feels a lot shorter. Like even the areas that traditionally would be a Castlevania spot, the sewers, the libraries, the whatevers, even the opening entrance area, they don't feel as fleshed out because they're not part of the main thing. These are just seeing the sights of what you would get. So even though I appreciate the changes that trying to get out of its own way, you do need a gigantic castle to make it a Castlevania game at the same time. Otherwise it's just some other random thing. I felt the same way about Curse of Darkness. Curse of Darkness didn't have Dracula's Castle other than like the end stage. So it was just disconnected areas. At least with Lament of Innocence, there were 5 separate story areas all in the same castle. You're just warped to different parts of it, but it still felt like the same castle that you're in. So it does change the scope if you're taking a lot of it away. As far as gameplay goes, a lot of Portrait of Ruin plays like Dawn of Sorrow's Julius mode, where you can switch between characters. Jonathan does a lot of the attacking and physical stuff. Charlotte does all the magic, and she has to, boost her attacks early before unleashing the magic, so it's more powerful, but it takes more to do. They also have this cool mechanic where they can dual crush. I believe that was the term. And sometimes they're really fun, sometimes they're not. One of my favorites is 1,000 Blades. And you can pretty much wreck any boss that stands still by using that move. You get it like right before the second boss, and that boss is a chump. Because she just stands in it. She doesn't jump, she doesn't do anything. So you can line up 1,000 Blades and you can just wreck face. And then any stationary target is just a joke. Another fun thing, I have to mention it because, of course, it's a meme with Portrait of Ruin. You can, always switch between the characters, and they will always say Jonathan, Charlotte. You're meant to do it as a means to traverse the castle, like you jump on someone's shoulders, or you work your way, switch back and forth to go through an area or whatever. But if you keep alternating, you can go Jonathan, Charlotte, Charlotte, Jonathan. It reminded me of like a Adult Swim commercial where they just made a joke out of that once. So yeah, it's on YouTube as a meme. Of course it is, but it's a fun little one. So I had to mention that because of course I did. The footage I watched back just to confirm that when I was doing this, they did the Charlotte Jonathan thing because of course they fucking did, and almost to an nth degree every chance they could, which is fine. Shanoa doesn't have any extra people around her. She just alternates like Soma's attack patterns do, ranging from fire attacks to weapons to all manner of things, and it really kind of just depends on the bosses that you're fighting and how it is. I will say the bosses in Portrait of Ruin are easy. The ones in Ecclesia are not. And there are times where I've not even been able to beat Ecclesia because of certain bosses and their placements. The one I remember is like in Dracula's castle. He's this like guy made out of a shadow. He summons his beast and he takes over half the screen, and like you're fighting him with like 3 steps to spare for distance. And yeah, you can manage it, but it's like, why can't I move? Why has this taken so much real estate for me? I don't have any recourse, especially when you consider you can't go next to him, so you can't do any, can't, because of course Castlevania, the most damage you'll ever take is contact damage from a boss. So it's like you're cutting away all the fun junk. And then, some other bosses are a little, easier than others, but I do distinctly remember that one being a dick. Of course, Death and Dracula make their appearances, and they're, varying levels of difficult or hard depending on the games that they're in. I don't find them that difficult in either game. Though it is an interesting story that Portrait of Ruin has Dracula and Death together as a boss fight for once, which is cool. I still distinctly remember Lament of Innocence having Death as the main boss. That was a different way of going about it, rather than facing Dracula himself. But the games are more Castlevania. That's just what you're in for. Are you reinventing the wheel when you're playing a Castlevania game? Not really. Once you get to Symphony of the Night, or unless you play the PS2 games, like, you kind of know the 3 styles of Castlevania games, and yeah, some of them are different here and there. The old school ones, the platformers, the Metroidvania ones, which is this one, and they kept doing until 2008. And then here and there, you would get the Devil May Cry ones for the PS2, or different ones from different types of games. And, of course, the God of War ripoffs, which is what started this whole mess. But realistically, like, the main 2 Castlevania types are the classic mode and the Metroidvania one. And the Metroidvania ones, there's not a whole lot of change from what you know. The music is the same. I would say the music in this, there's a few good songs per game, but I don't think they're up to the level of Symphony, or even Lament of Innocence had some really good stuff. Curse of Darkness had some really good stuff. It's, by and large, I wouldn't call them weak soundtracks, but there's not like a lot there. I would put them kind of in the middle. You can definitely get some good songs out of it. The castle themes themselves are good, and some of the stages are good, but they're not like I'm not going to go out of my way to just remember them because I have to. I remember Symphony of the Night because, oh my god, this stuff is very memorable. Some of the Aria or Dawn of Sorrow stuff I will remember. This not as much. But some people love both of these games because it continues the legacy of Castlevania the way it probably should have been. And imagine, like, these games aren't like the highest fidelity games on the planet. They were released for the DS. A lot of these games would have been released for the 3DS. And I said this when I finished Bloodstained. I said that had Konami just gone for the course, they would have kept this shit going. Igarashi would have kept it going forever, and we could have gotten, let's see, every 2 years, about 10 years, like 5 or 6 more games of varying quality for every one Bloodstained. Or, if you add in Curse of the Moon, we got 3 Bloodstained games for the price of like 5 or 6 Castlevania games. But again, there's that legacy there that you don't have. Bloodstained is Castlevania in name, but it just doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel like it should have been a thing. These were what Castlevania were. Because we took the old school Castlevania style and shifted over the SOTN style, the Metroidvania. This is what people wanted to play. And again, if they'd shifted to, the God of War stuff and it worked, maybe that would have been the style. But nobody wanted that. They wanted these. As has been borne out by what Bloodstained became. And who knows what those Castlevania games could have been if they would have just been reworkings of the Soma Cruise and the Shinoa style of gameplay. My guess is that's what they would have been, but there wouldn't have been anything wrong with that. And I think that re-releasing these DS games really encompasses what that 10-year period with those Metroidvania games did, because those were maybe not the biggest sellers in the world, but they were still Castlevania. It has a legacy that you can't really replicate, and they were willing to try different things to keep the series going without really shortchanging the old school narrative. And it is kind of a shame that these were the last 2, because you never could have envisioned what could have happened after that. I was playing these and thinking, all right, I'm ready for the next one. I had to wait 10 years to get the next one, and it was worth it, but at the same time, it wasn't worth it. I could have gotten so much more Castlevania, and I wouldn't have been sick of it at all. That's the thing I think people need to forget, is even if the quality of the games may not always be the best, or you might even get sick of it here and there, when you have a tried and true method and a formula that is really top notch, you stick with it. People know what they are getting, and that's what makes people understand, yeah, play these, you're gonna enjoy them. And the response to the Dominus collection bears that out, because people may not have played these when the DS was a thing. People may not even have the DS at all, but they have the PS4 or PS5, and now it's like, oh, I remember now. I get why people like this. This was 20 years ago. 15 years ago in some cases. 15, 20 years ago in these cases. And they still hold up. It's crazy to think, when you have a good game, what that does to carry a legacy for something. And the fact that it has to shift over to a different franchise now just to keep going is a bit of a disservice to what these 2 games provided. So, would I recommend Portrait of Ruin and Order of Ecclesia via the Dominus collection? Well, no shit. Of course I would. Like I said, I've always been sort of on the Metroidvania side of things. And if you're on the old school classic platformer version, that's totally fine. I resonated with this style. This is what Castlevania is like to me. But it serves all masters, I think. And that's the beauty of it, is that the franchise was willing to change and still be top-notch either way. But that will do for this week. And as stated, it's a little awkward because I had to change the schedule around a little bit to suit this. But next week we get Odd Taxi. So that episode's already done. Metal Gear Solid 3, which I'm actually going to start recording for, this weekend. So I'll get started and maybe not even beat it by the time I record the episode, but I'm well aware of the game anyway. Favorite anime openings and endings. That one should be interesting. God knows how long that one's going to be. Xenosaga 2, Sankarea, Final Fantasy glitches and translation errors, Gunslinger Girl, Apollo Justice, Ace Attorney, Casshern Sins, and I'm gonna kind of go back into the time machine and reflect on how I got into JRPGs and like which ones were kind of my thing, and kind of give a storyline, a timeline, if you will, of like why this channel is a thing. I might have mentioned it here and there in either Final Fantasy videos or some of the podcast anniversaries, but I don't think I ever like nailed down my history with this genre or Japanese games in general or anime, because anime is going to be its own separate episode. I think I might do both at the same time because they coordinate in so many different ways. The cross section is like right there. But I'll see when I get to that point if I want to make it an episode all to itself. But for now, I'll call this an episode, and I'll see you next time. Citizen Strife, signing off.